This book was generated using Speakter's AI voices. You can create human-like voiceovers in over 50 languages.
David Balfour was a 17-year-old orphan from Essendine in the Scottish Lowlands. His life was about to change dramatically, though he didn't know it yet. The morning sun had barely peeked over the horizon when a knock at the door startled David from his fitful sleep. Mr. Campbell, the local minister and his late father's friend, stood on the threshold, a worn envelope clutched in his weathered hands. David's heart quickened as he took the letter, its edges frayed and yellowed with age. As he unfolded the paper, the musty scent of secrets long kept filled his nostrils. His eyes darted across the page, drinking in words that spoke of an inheritance waiting at the House of Shaws, his ancestral home. A mix of excitement and apprehension churned in his stomach like a storm-tossed sea. With trembling hands, David began to pack his meager belongings. His fingers lingered on his father's old sword, its weight both comforting and daunting. The blade whispered of battles long past and adventures yet to come. As he lifted it, memories of his father flooded his mind, bittersweet and fleeting. Dawn broke, painting the sky in a palette of pinks and golds. The familiar streets of Essendine seemed to sigh as David set out, his worn boots crunching on the gravel path. Each step took him further from the only home he'd known and closer to an uncertain future. The Scottish countryside unfurled before him like a living tapestry. Rolling hills covered in purple heather gave way to forests so dense they seemed to swallow the light. The wind carried the scent of peat and wildflowers, a reminder of the untamed beauty of his homeland. As the day wore on, David's journey was punctuated by encounters that only deepened the mystery surrounding his destination. At a small inn, a kind-faced woman pulled him aside, her eyes darting nervously. "The House of Shaws, ye say?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "Best be careful, lad. That place has a reputation darker than a moonless night." Her words sent a shiver down David's spine, but also stoked the flames of his curiosity. What secrets lay hidden within the walls of his family home? Later, as the sun began its descent, David approached a surly ferryman. Built like a bear and just as gruff, the man's silence when asked about the House of Shaws was more unnerving than any warning. The gentle lapping of water against the boat did little to calm David's racing thoughts. As he journeyed on, the landscape seemed to mirror his growing unease. The path became treacherous, winding through craggy outcrops and boggy moors. Mist crept in, thick and oppressive, obscuring the way ahead. Each step became a leap of faith, the ground beneath his feet as uncertain as his future. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for David with grasping fingers. His heart sank as he caught his first glimpse of the House of Shaws. Instead of the grand estate he had imagined, a partially ruined structure cowered against the darkening sky. Overgrown vegetation choked the grounds, nature reclaiming what man had abandoned. Windows like hollow eyes stared blankly out at the world. The very stones of the house seemed to exude an aura of neglect and foreboding. David's feet felt leaden as he approached, each step bringing him closer to a destiny he was no longer sure he wanted to claim. The wind whispered through the decrepit structure, carrying with it the musty scent of secrets long buried. Despite the fear knotting his stomach, David pressed on. The weight of his father's sword at his side reminded him of the birthright he had come to claim. With a deep breath that did little to calm his racing heart, he steeled himself and continued towards the foreboding House of Shaws. As twilight deepened into night, shadows seemed to come alive, dancing at the edge of David's vision. The crumbling walls of the house loomed before him, a silent sentinel guarding long-forgotten truths. With each step, the air grew thicker, heavy with the weight of untold stories and hidden dangers. David paused at the edge of the overgrown path, his hand resting on the hilt of his father's sword. The House of Shaws stood before him, a dark silhouette against the star-studded sky. As he took his first step towards the decaying structure, a chill wind swept across the moor, carrying with it a whisper that sounded eerily like a warning. The air hung heavy with the scent of decay and neglect as David approached the crumbling edifice. Each step on the overgrown path seemed to whisper warnings, urging him to turn back. The air hung heavy with the scent of decay and neglect as David approached the crumbling edifice. Each step on the overgrown path seemed to whisper warnings, urging him to turn back. But curiosity and the desperate need to understand his heritage drove him forward. As he raised his hand to knock, the door creaked open of its own accord, revealing a figure as weathered and unwelcoming as the house itself. Ebenezer Balfour, David's uncle, stood before him, his small, suspicious eyes darting over David's form like a cornered animal assessing a threat. "So, you've come," Ebenezer grunted, his voice as rough as gravel. The words hung in the air between them, neither a welcome nor a dismissal. David swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "Uncle Ebenezer, I'm David Balfour, your nephew." Ebenezer's face twisted, as if tasting something sour. Without a word, he turned and shuffled back into the shadowy interior. David hesitated for a moment before following, the floorboards groaning beneath his feet like the lament of forgotten ghosts. The house's interior matched its master's demeanor, cold, sparse, and shrouded in shadows. Dust motes danced in the few shafts of light that managed to penetrate the grimy windows, painting a picture of long-standing neglect. David's eyes struggled to adjust to the gloom, picking out the faded outlines of what must have once been grand furnishings. "Sit," Ebenezer commanded, gesturing to a rickety chair. David complied, wincing at the chair's ominous creak. "Uncle," David ventured, his voice echoing in the cavernous room, "might you tell me about my father?" Ebenezer's eyes narrowed, a flash of something, fear, anger, crossing his features. "Best leave the past where it lies, boy," he growled, effectively slamming shut any door to David's heritage. The days that followed were a strange dance of avoidance and tension. David, driven by an insatiable curiosity, took it upon himself to explore the house and grounds. Each creaking floorboard and faded portrait seemed to whisper secrets, tantalizing clues about the Balfour legacy. But the more David uncovered, the more questions arose, leaving him feeling like a stranger in what should have been his ancestral home. One night, as the wind howled like a mournful ghost around the eaves, Ebenezer's true colors revealed themselves in a horrifying display. Under the guise of retrieving important papers, he sent David up to a tower with no stairs, a death trap masked by darkness. "Mind your step, lad," Ebenezer had said, his voice dripping with false concern. "It's a bit tricky up there." David's heart raced as he climbed, the rotting wood groaning beneath his feet. The darkness pressed in around him, thick as tar. Suddenly, his foot met empty air. Time seemed to slow as he teetered on the edge of oblivion, the yawning chasm below eager to swallow him whole. With a desperate lunge, David grabbed onto a protruding beam, his muscles screaming as he hauled himself to safety. As the reality of his uncle's murderous intent sank in, David's world tilted on its axis. The House of Shaws, once a symbol of hope and belonging, now felt like a prison, its walls closing in with malevolent intent. The following morning, Ebenezer's demeanor had shifted. Gone was the open hostility, replaced by a veneer of remorse so thin it was almost transparent. His eyes, however, still held that calculating gleam, like a predator biding its time. "I've been thinking, David," Ebenezer said over a meager breakfast, his voice carefully modulated. "Perhaps we got off on the wrong foot. I've a business proposition that might interest you, something that could secure your future." David's instincts screamed caution, but hope, that persistent, foolish thing, whispered that perhaps this was a chance to finally learn the truth about his inheritance. And so, against his better judgment, he agreed to accompany his uncle to meet Captain Hutchison at the port of Queensferry. As they made their way along the winding path to the pier, the salty air stung David's nostrils. The rhythmic crash of waves against the shore seemed to echo the turmoil in his mind. With each step, the weight of uncertainty pressed down upon him, his uncle's true intentions as murky as the churning sea before them. As they neared the pier, David's eyes scanned the bustling docks, searching for any sign of the mysterious Captain Hutchison. His heart quickened with a mix of anticipation and dread. What awaited him on this new journey? Would it bring the answers he sought or lead him further into the web of deceit his uncle had woven? Little did David know that as he stood there, poised on the threshold of a new adventure, fate was preparing to deal him a hand that would change the course of his life forever. The sea breeze carried with it the promise of revelation, but also the whisper of betrayal. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the pier, David took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever lay ahead. David stood on the pier at Queensferry, his heart light with anticipation. Little did he know that his world was about to be turned upside down by a cruel deception. The salty breeze ruffled his hair as he gazed at the Covenant, a sturdy brig anchored nearby. Its weathered hull and billowing sails promised adventure. But fate had other plans. A rough hand clasped David's shoulder, startling him. He turned to find Captain Hosison, a man with a face as craggy as the Scottish cliffs and eyes as cold as the North Sea. "Come aboard, lad," Hosison said, his honeyed words masking a sinister intent. "Let's show you the ship." David's feet had barely touched the deck when a chill ran down his spine. The ship lurched suddenly and he stumbled, his stomach dropping as realization dawned. The shoreline was already receding, becoming a thin line on the horizon. Panic clawed at his chest as the truth hit him like a punch to the gut. His uncle Ebenezer had sold him into slavery. "No!" David cried out, but his voice was lost in the wind and the creaking of the ship's timbers. The crew, a motley assortment of rough men, eyed David with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. Their calloused hands and sun-weathered faces told stories of hard lives at sea. One burly sailor grabbed David's arm, his grip like iron, and shoved him below deck. The musty air of the hold engulfed David like a shroud. In the cramped, dark space, he huddled against the damp wood, his nose wrinkling at the stench of unwashed bodies and rotting food. Rats scurried in the shadows, their tiny claws scratching a haunting melody that seemed to mock his predicament. Time stretched endlessly in this floating prison. Captain Hosison's words echoed in David's mind like a death knell. "The Carolinas, boy, that's where you'll fetch a fine price." The thought of being sold as an indentured servant in a foreign land made David's blood run cold, his future stretching before him like a vast, empty ocean. As days blurred together, David was occasionally allowed on deck for brief reprieves. The vast expanse of the sea, once a symbol of adventure, now mocked his captivity. He observed the brutal rhythm of life aboard the Covenant, each creak of the ship's timbers a reminder of his powerlessness. Among the crew, one face stood out. Ransom, the young cabin boy. His eyes, wide with fear, reflected David's own terror. The lad's thin frame bore the marks of frequent beatings, his spirit seemingly as broken as his body. David's heart ached for the boy, seeing in him a reflection of his own helplessness. The complex dance between Captain Hosison and his first mate, Mr. Shuan, added another layer of tension to the already strained atmosphere. Shuan, a man with fists like hammers and a temper to match, prowled the deck like a caged beast. His violent outbursts sent the crew scurrying, their faces masks of fear and resentment. One stormy night, as the ship pitched and rolled on angry waves, David's ears caught the sound of a heated argument. Shuan's voice, thick with drink and rage, rose above the howling wind. Ransom's pleading replies were cut short by a sickening thud, followed by an eerie silence that chilled David to the bone. The next day, Ransom was nowhere to be seen. The crew's averted gazes and hushed whispers confirmed David's worst fears. The boy's absence hung over the ship like a dark cloud, a grim reminder of the brutality that ruled their floating world. As the voyage stretched on, David battled not only the harsh realities of life aboard a slave ship, but also the relentless assault of seasickness. His stomach churned in time with the rolling waves, each day a test of endurance. Yet even as his body weakened, his spirit remained unbroken. In quiet moments, David's mind raced, searching for any opportunity to escape or change his fate. He clung to hope like a lifeline, his determination a flickering flame in the darkness of his circumstances. As the ship sailed on towards an uncertain future, David steeled himself for whatever challenges lay ahead, his heart set on reclaiming his freedom and exposing the injustice that had brought him to this watery hell. As night fell and the stars emerged like pinpricks in a velvet sky, David leaned against the ship's railing, his eyes scanning the horizon. The sea stretched endlessly in all directions, a vast, dark expanse that seemed to mirror the emptiness in his heart. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught his eye. Squinting into the darkness, David's breath caught in his throat. Was that a small boat bobbing in the distance? And was that a lone figure waving frantically? His heart raced with a mixture of hope and fear. Could this be his chance for salvation? Or was it just another cruel trick of fate? The Covenant's journey took an unexpected turn as it sailed through the choppy waters. Suddenly, the crew spotted a small boat bobbing in the distance, carrying a lone passenger who would change the course of their voyage. Salt spray stung David's eyes as he leaned over the ship's rail, squinting at the approaching vessel. The sea churned beneath them, mirroring the unease in his gut. As the small boat drew nearer, a figure emerged from the mist like a specter from another world. There, standing proud and defiant against the wind, was Breck Stewart. His tartan kilt whipped about his legs, and his eyes blazed with a fierce determination that seemed to challenge the very sea itself. David's breath caught in his throat. Here was a man who commanded attention without uttering a word. Captain Hosiason's weathered face creased with reluctance as he grudgingly agreed to transport Alan to Linalock. The deck groaned under Alan's boots as he strode aboard, his presence electric. David couldn't tear his gaze away from the newcomer, drinking in every detail of his appearance and bearing. When Alan spoke, his thick Highland accent rolled like distant thunder. Each word dripped with pride and conviction, painting vivid pictures of a world David had only imagined. Despite their differences, Alan a staunch Jacobite and David a loyal Whig, an inexplicable connection began to form between them. As the ship cut through the waves, Alan's tales of adventure washed over David like the sea spray. Stories of daring escapes and secret missions danced in the air, almost tangible in their intensity. David listened, his mind a whirlpool of fascination and skepticism, torn between the allure of Alan's world and the beliefs he'd always held dear. "You see, lad," Alan said, his eyes twinkling like stars on a clear Highland night, "there's more to this world than what meets the eye. Loyalty, honor, these are the things that truly matter." David nodded, absorbing Alan's words like parched earth, soaking up rain. The sea breeze ruffled his hair as he pondered the complexities of allegiance and duty, feeling as though he stood on the precipice of a great change. But the peaceful moments were as fleeting as sea foam on the shore. As night fell and the ship creaked in the darkness, David's ears pricked at the sound of hushed voices. Hidden in the shadows, he strained to make out the words, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Snippets of a sinister conversation slithered through the air like venomous snakes. "Kill him for the money belt." The words chilled David to the bone, each syllable a dagger of ice in his gut. Suddenly, the young man found himself at a crossroads, the weight of a terrible choice pressing down on him like the depths of the ocean. Should he warn Alan and risk his own life, or stay silent and bear the crushing weight of guilt? The moral dilemma gnawed at him relentlessly, each second of indecision an eternity of torment. Time seemed to slow as David wrestled with his conscience. He pictured Alan's lifeless body thrown overboard, his stories and passion silenced forever, swallowed by the uncaring sea. The image was too much to bear, a nightmare made real. With trembling hands and a heart racing like a storm-tossed ship, David made his choice. Honor, he decided, was worth any risk. He sought out Alan, his whispered warning cutting through the night like a knife through fog. "They're planning to kill you," David hissed, his eyes darting nervously, searching the shadows for eavesdroppers. "We need to act fast." Alan's face hardened, the lines etching deeper like canyons carved by time. But a glimmer of respect shone in his eyes, a beacon of hope in the darkness. "You've got more courage than I gave you credit for, lad," he said, clasping David's shoulder with a grip like iron. "Now let's show these scoundrels what happens when they cross a Highland warrior and a man of honor." As they huddled together in the dim light, formulating a plan to defend themselves against the treacherous crew, David felt a shift in their relationship. What had begun as curiosity had transformed into a bond forged in the crucible of danger. Together they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, an unlikely alliance that would prove crucial in the perilous journey to come. The ship creaked ominously around them, the sound of approaching footsteps growing louder with each passing moment. David's heart raced as he and Alan exchanged a final, determined look. They had precious little time to prepare for the coming storm. With grim resolve, they began to gather what meager weapons they could find, knowing that their very lives hung in the balance. The roundhouse loomed before them, their last bastion of hope against the mutinous crew. As they barricaded themselves inside, David couldn't help but wonder, would their hastily made plans be enough to survive the night? David and Alan steeled themselves for the impending attack from the mutinous crew. They hastily fortified their position in the roundhouse, the ship's officers' quarters, gathering whatever weapons they could find. Night descended upon the ship like a heavy shroud, bringing with it an oppressive silence broken only by the gentle creaking of timbers and the muffled voices of the crew outside. The air inside the roundhouse was thick with tension, almost suffocating in its intensity. David's heart thundered in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears as he gripped his pistol with sweaty palms. He glanced at Alan, marveling at the older man's composure. Alan stood tall, a picture of calm determination, as he tested the edge of his sword with a practiced thumb, the soft scraping sound oddly comforting in the eerie quiet. The stillness shattered like glass as the door suddenly shuddered under the weight of the first assault. David's breath caught in his throat, a mixture of fear and anticipation coursing through his veins. Alan sprang into action, his blade a silver blur in the dim light. The clash of steel on steel filled the air, a cacophony of violence punctuated by grunts of exertion and cries of pain. Initially frozen with fear, David found himself moving on pure instinct. He dodged a wild swing from a burly sailor, the rush of air from the near miss sending a chill down his spine. Retaliating with a clumsy but effective blow, David felt a surge of pride as his attacker stumbled back. The pistol in his hand, once foreign and unwieldy, now felt like an extension of his arm. He fired, the acrid smell of gunpowder mixing with the salty sea air, creating a potent cocktail that burned his nostrils. Wave after wave of attackers came, each repelled by the unlikely duo. Alan fought like a man possessed, his sword singing a deadly tune as it found its mark time and again. David marveled at his companion's skill, even as he struggled to hold his own ground. The wooden walls of the roundhouse bore silent witness to their desperate struggle, scarred by errant blades and stray bullets. The battle reached its crescendo as Alan engaged Mr. Shuan in a deadly dance. Their blades met in a shower of sparks, the sound of metal on metal ringing out like a twisted melody. Neither man was willing to yield, their eyes locked in a fierce battle of wills. In a moment that seemed to stretch for an eternity, Alan's sword found its mark, sliding between Mr. Shuan's ribs with lethal precision. The brutal sailor's eyes widened in shock, a look of disbelief etched on his face before the light faded from them entirely. As the night wore on, David surprised himself with his newfound courage. He moved with a grace he never knew he possessed, his earlier clumsiness replaced by a fluid efficiency. Each successful parry, each landed blow, filled him with a fierce pride that pushed back the edges of his exhaustion. The din of battle ebbed and flowed like the tides, sometimes a deafening roar, other times an unsettling quiet, broken only by labored breathing and the occasional groan of pain. The first light of dawn painted the horizon in hues of pink and gold, a stark contrast to the violence that had consumed the night. David and Alan found themselves battered but unbeaten, their clothes torn and stained, their bodies aching from the prolonged fight. The floor around them was littered with the evidence of their night-long struggle, discarded weapons, splinters of wood, and dark stains that David tried not to think about too closely. Though the attacks had ceased, danger still hung in the air like a thick fog. David could feel the hostility radiating from the remaining crew members who surrounded their stronghold. The ship seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move in this deadly game. It was Captain Hosison who finally broke the stalemate. His voice, hoarse from a night of shouting orders, called for a parley. David and Alan exchanged a wary glance, their shared experience of the night's perils having forged a bond stronger than steel between them. As they prepared to face whatever came next, David realized how much had changed in just one night. He was no longer the same person who had entered this roundhouse. The trials of the past hours had tempered him, like a sword in a forge, leaving him stronger but forever altered. His hands, once soft and unused to violence, now bore the calluses and cuts of a fighter. The pair stood side by side, ready to negotiate from their hard-won position of strength. They were outnumbered, yes, but far from defeated. As the door creaked open to admit Captain Husseason, David took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever challenges lay ahead in the tense atmosphere that now gripped the ship. But fate had other plans. Just as Captain Husseason stepped into the roundhouse, a violent lurch sent everyone stumbling. The ship groaned ominously, timbers creaking in protest. Through the porthole, David caught a glimpse of a rocky coastline looming dangerously close. The Covenant was approaching the treacherous coast of Scotland, and as it neared the Isle of Mull, the ship found itself at the mercy of increasingly turbulent waters. David's heart sank as he realized their hard-fought victory might be short-lived, with a new, potentially deadlier challenge now threatening to engulf them all. The Covenant approached the treacherous coast of Scotland, its wooden hull groaning under the strain. As it neared the Isle of Mull, the ship found itself at the mercy of increasingly turbulent waters. The air grew thick with tension, mirroring the churning sea beneath them. Without warning, the sky darkened to an ominous gray, and a violent storm descended upon them. Rain lashed the deck in stinging sheets, each droplet feeling like a tiny needle against exposed skin. Massive waves crashed over the railings, sending sailors scrambling for purchase on the slippery planks. The wind howled like a banshee, drowning out the frantic shouts of the crew. David's heart raced as he clung to a rope, his knuckles white with effort. The rough hemp bit into his palms, but he dared not loosen his grip. His eyes strained through the driving rain, desperately searching for Alan in the chaos. The ship lurched sickeningly, and David's stomach clenched with fear. They were being driven towards the rocky shoreline, jagged teeth waiting to tear the Covenant apart. A deafening crack split the air, reverberating through David's very bones as the ship struck a hidden reef. The impact threw him to the deck, knocking the wind from his lungs. He gasped like a fish out of water, struggling to his feet as the ship began to break apart around him. Timbers groaned and splintered, the once proud vessel now at the mercy of the sea. In the confusion, a monstrous wave swept across the deck. David felt himself lifted off his feet, the world spinning like a child's top as he was flung into the churning waters. The shock of the icy sea stole his breath away, replacing it with a burning saltiness that filled his mouth and nose. He flailed wildly, fighting against the powerful currents that threatened to drag him under. Each wave seemed determined to push him back out to sea, away from the faint hope of land. His limbs grew heavy as lead, muscles burning with exhaustion. But a primal instinct for survival drove David on, forcing him to keep swimming even as his strength waned. The taste of salt filled his mouth as he gasped for air, each breath a desperate battle against the relentless sea. After what felt like hours of struggle, David's feet finally scraped against sand. With the last reserves of his energy, he dragged himself onto a beach, collapsing onto the wet sand. The world spun around him like a drunken carousel, his lungs heaving as he gulped in precious air. As consciousness faded, his last thought was one of sheer gratitude to be alive. Dawn broke, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds that seemed to mock the previous night's violence. David stirred, his body aching as if he'd been beaten by a gang of thugs. He pushed himself up, blinking in confusion at his surroundings. A small barren island stretched before him, rocky and windswept. The events of the night came rushing back, and with them, a crushing realization. He was stranded, alone, with no idea where he was. The days that followed were a brutal test of endurance. David's stomach gnawed with constant hunger, a relentless beast never fully satisfied by the meager shellfish and seabirds' eggs he managed to scavenge. The wind seemed to cut right through him like an icy blade, carrying with it the chill of the sea. He cobbled together a crude shelter from driftwood and seaweed, but it provided little comfort against the elements. Each morning, hope drove David to climb to the island's highest point. He would scan the horizon, praying to see a ship, a boat, any sign of rescue. But day after day, he was met with nothing but the endless expanse of sea and sky, as vast and empty as his growing despair. The isolation began to wear on him, his thoughts turning dark and desperate. In quiet moments, David's mind wandered to Alan. Had his friend survived the shipwreck? Were there other survivors, or was he truly alone? The uncertainty gnawed at him like a rat at a rope, almost as painful as the physical hardships he endured. As the days stretched on, David felt his resolve beginning to crumble. The constant battle against hunger, cold, and loneliness took its toll. He found himself talking aloud, if only to hear a human voice in the desolate landscape. Sleep brought little respite, his dreams filled with phantom rescue ships that always vanished upon waking, leaving him more bereft than before. But even in his darkest moments, a stubborn spark of hope refused to be extinguished. David clung to the belief that somehow, some way, he would find a way off this God-forsaken rock. It was this determination that led to his salvation. On what felt like the 100th exploration of the island's perimeter, David made a discovery that changed everything. As the tide receded, he noticed a stretch of sand connecting his island to a larger landmass in the distance. His heart leapt like a salmon swimming upstream. He wasn't on an island at all, but a tidal island, linked to Mull at low tide. With renewed energy, David waited impatiently for the perfect moment. As soon as the water level dropped enough, he set out across the temporary land bridge. His legs, weak from days of poor nutrition, trembled beneath him like saplings in a storm. But the promise of escape, of continuing his journey, drove him forward. At last, David's feet touched the soil of Mull. He fell to his knees, overcome with emotion. Though still far from safety, he had overcome a tremendous obstacle. As he looked back at the small island that had been both his prison and his lifeline, David felt a surge of determination course through him like electricity. He turned and began walking inland, ready to face whatever adventures awaited him. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the unfamiliar landscape, a chilling realization crept over David. He had escaped one prison only to find himself in another. The vast, wild expanse of Mull stretched before him, filled with unknown dangers and challenges. How would he survive this new test of will and endurance? David had escaped Erraid, but his journey was far from over. He now faced the daunting task of traversing the rugged island of Mull. The Highland terrain stretched before him like a wild, untamed beast, its steep hills and boggy valleys a formidable challenge to the young lowlander. As David's feet touched Mull's rocky shore, the salty sea breeze whipped through his hair, carrying the tang of adventure and a whisper of danger. The landscape unfurled before him, a patchwork of vibrant greens and muted browns, dotted with splashes of purple heather. It was a world away from the familiar streets of his lowland home, and David felt a mix of excitement and trepidation course through him. With each step, his boots sank into the soggy earth, the ground seeming to resist his progress. The dense forest loomed ahead, ancient trees standing like silent sentinels, their branches intertwined in a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. The air was thick with the earthy scent of moss and damp bark, filling David's lungs with each breath. As he pushed deeper into the island's interior, David's stomach growled with hunger, a sharp reminder of his vulnerability. He realized he would need to rely on the kindness of strangers to survive. His first encounter with the local inhabitants was a mix of hope and fear. A weathered old crofter, his face etched with the lines of a hard life, greeted David in Gaelic. The foreign words washed over him like a wave, leaving him feeling even more lost than before. But hunger is a universal language, and the crofter's wife took pity on the bedraggled young man. She offered him a bowl of thin broth and a hunk of coarse bread. As David ate, gratitude warming him from the inside, he couldn't help but notice the poverty that surrounded him. The crofter's cottage was little more than a hovel, its thatched roof sagging under the weight of years. The stark reality of Highland life began to sink in. As night fell, David found himself huddled in the lee of a great boulder, the rock offering some small protection from the biting wind. He gazed up at the star-studded sky, trying to remember the constellations his father had once taught him. The North Star winked at him, a faint beacon of hope in the vast darkness. In that moment, loneliness washed over him like a cold wave, and he wondered if he'd ever see a friendly face again. Days blended into nights as David continued his journey. He learned to ford icy rivers, the frigid water numbing his legs and stealing his breath. He scrambled up treacherous mountain passes, his hands raw and bleeding from gripping sharp rocks. With each obstacle overcome, his determination grew stronger, like a flame fed by adversity. The boy who had left the lowlands was slowly being forged into a man of the Highlands. The land revealed itself to David in all its harsh beauty and complex history. He passed the ruins of cottages, their blackened stones silent witnesses to the aftermath of the Jacobite rebellions. He saw the wary looks exchanged between Highlanders and the occasional English-speaking settler, feeling the tension that simmered just beneath the surface. Every interaction was a lesson in the delicate balance of power and loyalty that defined life in the Highlands. Through it all, David kept his eyes and ears open for any news of Alan or the Covenant. Each person he met was a potential source of information, each conversation a possible clue. But the Highlands kept their secrets close, and David's questions often met with guarded silence or vague responses. The frustration of not knowing gnawed at him, driving him forward even as exhaustion weighed heavily on his shoulders. As he neared the coast, David's clothes were tattered, his body lean and weathered by the elements. But his spirit remained unbroken, tempered by the challenges he had faced and overcome. He had learned to read the land, to find food and shelter where before he would have seen only wilderness. The Highlands had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. It was then, when hope seemed to flicker like a candle in the wind, that fate intervened. As David rounded a bend in the path, his eyes fell upon a familiar figure. For a moment he thought his mind was playing tricks on him, conjuring visions born of desperation and loneliness. But no, it was real. There, standing before him with a look of equal surprise and joy, was Alan Breck Stewart. The two friends stared at each other for a heartbeat before rushing forward, their embrace a tangle of laughter and relief. "David, my lad," Alan exclaimed, his voice rough with emotion. "I never thought to see you again." As they pulled apart, David saw the admiration in Alan's eyes. The older man looked him up and down, taking in the changes wrought by David's journey. "You've done well, lad," Alan said softly. "To survive Mull alone, it's no small feat." David felt a surge of pride at Alan's words. He had changed, grown in ways he was only beginning to understand. As they shared their stories, the bond between them deepened, forged in the fires of adversity and tempered by shared experience. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Alan turned to David with a glint in his eye. "What say you, David? Shall we continue this journey together? Between your newfound skills and my knowledge of the Highlands, I'd say we make a formidable team." David grinned, feeling for the first time in days a sense of true hope and excitement for what lay ahead. "Aye, Alan," he replied, his voice strong and sure. "Together we'll face whatever the Highlands throw our way." And so, with renewed purpose and strengthened friendship, David and Alan set off into the gathering twilight. As they crested a hill, Alan pointed to a distant valley, his face suddenly serious. "We're heading into Appin now, lad," he said, his voice low. "My home ground. But remember, not all who call this place home will welcome me back with open arms." David felt a chill run down his spine, sensing that their reunion might be short-lived if they weren't careful. What dangers awaited them in the heart of Stewart territory? David and Alan's journey led them into Appin, the heart of Stewart territory. This was Alan's home ground, a place he knew intimately, like the lines etched on his own palm. The dense wood enveloped them, its ancient trees standing sentinel. The air hung heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, a primal aroma that filled David's lungs with each breath. Shafts of sunlight pierced the canopy, dappling the forest floor with golden patches that danced as the breeze stirred the leaves. The crunch of fallen foliage beneath their feet seemed thunderous in the eerie silence that blanketed the woods. David's nerves were on edge, every snapping twig making him flinch. He glanced at Alan, marveling at his friend's calm demeanor. How could he be so at ease in this tense atmosphere? Suddenly, the peaceful quiet shattered like a mirror dropped on stone. The thundering of hooves echoed through the trees, growing louder with each passing heartbeat. David's pulse quickened, matching the rhythm of the approaching horses. He and Alan exchanged a quick, panicked glance before diving behind a thick oak tree. Peering out cautiously, they spotted a small party on horseback through the foliage. At its center rode a man whose very presence seemed to command attention. Colin Roy Campbell, known far and wide as the Red Fox. David had heard whispers of this man, a ruthless government agent tasked with collecting rents from the Stewart clan. Campbell's reputation preceded him like a dark storm cloud, promising trouble wherever he went. As Campbell and his entourage passed by, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on, pressing down on David like a physical weight. He felt a bead of sweat trickle down his spine, his muscles coiled tight as a spring ready to snap. Without warning, a deafening crack split the air. The gunshot's echo reverberated through the trees, sending birds scattering in panic. Time slowed to a crawl as David watched Campbell's body jerk violently, then slump forward. The man tumbled from his horse, hitting the ground with a sickening thud that seemed to shake the very earth. Chaos erupted in an instant. The forest, moments ago so quiet, now rang with shouts of alarm and confusion. Campbell's companions dismounted in a frenzy, their eyes wild with fear as they searched frantically for the unseen assassin. David's mind reeled, struggling to process the shocking scene before him. His legs trembled, urging him to flee. But Alan's iron grip on his arm held him in place, his friend's eyes conveying a silent warning. Flight now would be as good as an admission of guilt. The sound of pursuit grew closer, branches snapping and undergrowth rustling as searchers combed the area. David's heart pounded so loudly he was sure it would give them away. He could taste the metallic tang of fear on his tongue, his mouth dry as sand. Alan's face was a mask of grim determination as he weighed their options, his eyes darting about like a cornered animal's. In a moment of decisive action, Alan leaned in close, his breath hot on David's ear. "We must part ways," he whispered urgently, his voice barely audible over the commotion. "It's our only chance. Meet me at the Silver Birch by the old stone bridge, when the moon is highest." David nodded, his throat too tight to speak. The weight of their situation pressed down on him like a physical force, threatening to crush him. They were now fugitives, innocent men caught in a web of violence and politics beyond their control. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, leaving him breathless. With a final, meaningful look, Alan melted into the shadows of the forest. David watched him go, feeling suddenly alone and vulnerable, like a child lost in the dark. Taking a deep breath, he steeled himself for what lay ahead. The sounds of pursuit grew ever closer, branches cracking like gunshots in the tense air. David slipped away in the opposite direction, his heart heavy with uncertainty as he faced the perilous journey that awaited him. As he moved through the forest, each step taking him further from the scene of the crime, a chilling thought crept into his mind. The murder of Colin Roy Campbell would send shockwaves through the Highlands, and he and Alan were now at the epicenter of a storm that threatened to consume them both. With the weight of this realization pressing down on him, David pushed deeper into the unknown, the shadows of the forest closing in around him like the jaws of a trap. The murder of Colin Roy Campbell sent shockwaves through the Highlands. David and Alan found themselves at the center of a massive manhunt, their lives hanging in the balance. The air hummed with tension, thick as fog rolling over the moors. Government troops, led by the ruthless Captain Hector Duncansby, swarmed across the countryside like angry bees. Their heavy boots crushed delicate purple heather, the sweet scent mixing with the acrid smell of fear that clung to David's skin. Heart pounding, David reunited with Alan at their meeting point. The older man's face was etched with worry, his eyes constantly darting to scan their surroundings. Without a word, they plunged into a desperate flight across the rugged Scottish landscape. The hills stretched before them, an endless sea of green and brown. Alan's knowledge of the land proved invaluable as he guided them through hidden glens and along narrow paths. David's legs burned with each step, his lungs struggling to pull in enough of the crisp mountain air. "Keep moving, lad," Alan whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind that howled around them like a pack of hungry wolves. They scaled treacherous mountain passes, David's hands soon raw and bleeding from the rough stone. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest, but the fear of capture drove him onward. Icy rivers barred their path, the frigid water shocking David's system with each crossing. He gasped, teeth chattering, as Alan's steady hand on his shoulder guided him forward. Dense forests swallowed them, the trees looming overhead like silent giants. Every snapping twig sent a jolt of panic through David's body. His imagination ran wild, conjuring images of soldiers closing in from all sides. Close calls became terrifyingly routine. One afternoon, the distant bark of tracking dogs sent them scrambling into a peat bog. David held his breath, the acrid smell of decay filling his nostrils as he sank into the muck. He locked eyes with Alan, both men frozen in place as voices drifted tantalizingly close. Time seemed to stretch like taffy until the danger finally passed. Nights brought little comfort. On a windswept hillside, they found themselves surrounded by the flickering glow of soldiers' campfires. For hours, David and Alan lay motionless among the rocks, scarcely daring to breathe. The cold seeped into their bones, David's muscles cramping painfully. Only the pale light of dawn allowed them to slip away, exhausted and shaken. As days blurred together, David felt his body pushed to its absolute limit. Yet in this crucible of hardship, he found an unexpected source of strength in Alan. They shared meager meals of foraged berries and the occasional gift from sympathetic crofters, each morsel savored like a feast. During brief moments of rest, they took turns keeping watch. David marveled at the transformation of their relationship. What had begun as reluctant partnership had been forged by adversity into something deeper. He noticed the lines of worry etched on Alan's face, the way the older man's hands sometimes trembled with fatigue. Yet Alan's spirit remained unbroken, his wit sharp even in the darkest hours. "Cheer up, lad," Alan would say, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "We're not caught yet, and where there's life, there's hope." Those words became David's lifeline, a mantra to cling to when despair threatened to overwhelm him. The harsh journey tested not only their physical resilience, but the very fabric of their friendship. There were moments of frustration, of fear-driven anger, but always they found their way back to each other, united by a shared determination to survive. On their final night in the wilderness, the wind keened a mournful song around them. David felt a profound sense of gratitude as he huddled close to Alan for warmth. Whatever trials lay ahead, he knew that in Alan, he had found not just a companion, but a true friend. As the first light of dawn painted the sky, David's heart leapt with a mixture of hope and trepidation. They had survived the initial pursuit, but their ordeal was far from over. Alan's face was grim as he spoke in a low voice. "We've no choice now, David," he said. "We must turn to the clans for help. It's a dangerous game, but our only hope of survival." David nodded, swallowing hard. The complex web of Highland clan loyalties was as treacherous as any mountain pass they had crossed. As they set out toward the nearest settlement, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to trade one perilous situation for another, potentially even deadlier than the one they just escaped. David and Alan found themselves in a desperate situation, hunted and on the run. They turned to the complex network of Highland clans, hoping to find refuge and assistance in their time of need. The rugged landscape of the Highlands stretched before them, a patchwork of misty valleys and craggy peaks. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and heather, and the eerie silence was broken only by the occasional cry of a distant bird. David's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of the danger that lurked around every corner. Their first port of call was the Stewarts, Alan's own clan. As they approached the hidden bothy, David's palms grew sweaty, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig could be the sound of their pursuers closing in. The bothy seemed to materialize out of the mist, a rough stone shelter nestled against a hillside, like a secret whispered by the land itself. Inside, they were met with wary but welcoming faces. The clan's hospitality washed over them like a warm breeze, soothing their frayed nerves. Fresh clothing replaced their tattered garments, the rough fabric a comfort against their skin. Warm food filled their empty bellies, the rich aroma of stew making David's mouth water. As they ate, he observed the clan's interactions with fascination. The air crackled with unspoken words and meaningful glances, a silent language he was only beginning to understand. "We can't stay long," Alan murmured, his eyes darting to the door. "The longer we're here, the greater the danger to these good people." David nodded, feeling the weight of their presence pressing down on the small community. They bid farewell to the Stewarts, the warmth of their brief respite quickly fading as they stepped back into the chill Highland air. Their next hope lay with the McLarens, a clan with historical ties to the Stewarts. The journey was fraught with tension, every sound a potential threat. David's muscles ached with a constant strain of vigilance, his mind racing with every possible scenario. When they finally reached the McLaren chieftain, they found a man torn between duty and sympathy. His weathered face creased with worry as he spoke in hushed tones. "I wish I could do more," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "But the government's eyes are everywhere these days." That night, David and Alan found themselves in a damp cave, huddled together for warmth. The darkness pressed in around them, broken only by the faint glow of embers from their carefully hidden fire. Outside, owl hoots and whispered words served as secret signals, bringing them meager supplies and snippets of information. As they continued their journey, each encounter with a new clan felt like stepping onto a knife's edge. Some offered help readily, their eyes lighting up at the sight of Alan, whose reputation as a Jacobite preceded him. Others hesitated, fear of government reprisal evident in their guarded expressions. One evening, as they sat by a small fire, its flames casting dancing shadows on the cave walls, Alan spoke softly. "It's not just about me anymore, David. Every person who helps us is taking a risk. The old ways are changing, and not everyone's sure where they stand." David nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. The Highlands were more than just a landscape. They were a complex tapestry of loyalties, traditions, and changing times. Each interaction peeled back another layer, revealing the deep-seated tensions that simmered beneath the surface. As the days wore on, David found himself changed by their experiences. The weight of their situation pressed down on him, yet he felt a growing strength within himself, forged by the challenges they faced. He was no longer just an observer, but a part of this intricate dance of survival and allegiance. Their journey continued, each step taking them deeper into the heart of the Highlands and the complex social and political landscape that defined it. The lingering tensions from past conflicts hung in the air like mist, while the encroaching authority of the British government cast long shadows over the traditional Highland ways. As night fell on their last evening in the Highlands, David and Alan stood at the edge of a cliff, gazing out at the vast expanse before them. The path to Queensferry lay ahead, a journey fraught with unknown perils. David's heart raced as he contemplated the challenges that awaited them. With a deep breath, he turned to Alan, determination etched on his face. "We leave at first light," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. As they retreated to their makeshift camp, neither man spoke of the dangers that lurked in the shadows, waiting to test their resolve with each step towards their uncertain future. David and Alan embarked on their perilous journey towards Queensferry. With each step, their hearts pounded as they faced the numerous obstacles and close calls that lay ahead. The Scottish landscape unfurled before them like a living tapestry, ever-changing and treacherous. Misty glens, their edges softened by a perpetual haze, gave way to craggy mountains that clawed at the sky. The damp air clung to their skin like a second, clammy skin, a constant reminder of the harsh elements they battled against. As they trudged through a particularly dense patch of forest, the sudden sound of approaching hoofbeats sent a jolt of terror through David's body. Without a word, Alan grabbed his arm, pulling him towards a thundering waterfall nearby. They scrambled behind the curtain of water, the roar drowning out their ragged breathing. David's clothes, already damp from the misty air, now clung to him like a cold, heavy shroud. He fought the urge to shiver, knowing the slightest movement could betray their position. Alan's eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned their surroundings. His face was a mask of concentration, every muscle taut with tension. David marveled at his companion's composure, drawing strength from Alan's unwavering focus. As the danger passed and they continued their journey, the world around them began to shift. The wild, untamed hills of the Highlands gradually gave way to the more orderly landscape of the lowlands. Neatly tended fields replaced rugged moors, and small villages dotted the horizon. For David, the sight of these familiar surroundings stirred a bittersweet ache in his chest. Homesickness washed over him, a feeling both comforting and painful. Alan, however, grew visibly tenser as they approached more populated areas. His eyes darted about constantly, assessing every potential threat. "We'll need to blend in," he muttered, his voice thick with reluctance. "No more Highland dress for me." David watched as his proud friend donned lowland attire. The transformation was striking and somewhat unsettling. Alan's bearing, usually so confident and defiant, seemed diminished somehow. It was as if a majestic lion had been forced to wear a house cat's collar, his wild spirit momentarily caged by necessity. Their journey brought them face to face with a kaleidoscope of characters, each encounter a test of their wit and nerve. A kind-faced farmer, his eyes crinkling with sympathy, offered them shelter in his barn. The sweet scent of hay and the warmth of livestock provided a brief respite from their flight, allowing them a moment to catch their breath and tend to their aching bodies. But not all encounters were so welcoming. At a roadside inn, the innkeeper's suspicious gaze followed their every move, his narrowed eyes seeming to pierce through their carefully constructed facade. David's heart raced as he spun a tale of two merchants on a buying trip, praying his trembling hands wouldn't betray the lie. He could feel sweat beading on his forehead, and it took every ounce of willpower to maintain eye contact with the skeptical innkeeper. Alan's quick wit and David's growing confidence saw them through countless close calls. They left false trails, spread conflicting rumors about their whereabouts, and slipped through their pursuers' fingers like smoke on the wind. With each successful evasion, David felt a mix of exhilaration and fear, knowing that one misstep could spell their doom. The physical toll of their flight weighed heavily on both men. Hunger gnawed at their bellies like a relentless beast. Fatigue dragged at their limbs, turning even the simplest movements into Herculean efforts. The constant stress of potential capture etched lines on their faces, aging them beyond their years. Yet in the midst of their hardships, a bond stronger than brotherhood began to form between them. Around flickering campfires, they shared stories of their lives before this mad adventure. David spoke of his dreams of university, his eyes shining with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Alan, in turn, regaled him with tales of Highland battles and ancient clan feuds, his voice taking on a lyrical quality as he recounted the legends of his people. Laughter, rare and precious, sometimes bubbled up between them, a balm for their weary spirits. As they approached Queensferry, the air grew thick with tension, almost palpable in its intensity. More people meant more eyes, more chances of discovery. David's palms grew sweaty as they navigated bustling market squares and busy docks. The cacophony of voices, the clatter of cartwheels on cobblestones, and the salty tang of the sea air assaulted his senses, threatening to overwhelm him. "We're close now, lad," Alan murmured, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. "But don't let your guard down. The most dangerous part of our journey may still lie ahead." David nodded, squaring his shoulders. They had come so far, faced so much. Whatever challenges awaited them in Queensferry, they would face them together. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, they crested a hill overlooking the town. There, spread out before them like a promise and a threat, lay Queensferry. The bustling port town teemed with activity, even as night approached. Ships' masts swayed gently in the harbor, and the distant sound of sailors' voices carried on the breeze. Somewhere in that maze of streets and buildings lay the key to their carefully laid plans, a chance to confront Ebenezer Balfour and reclaim David's rightful inheritance. David's heart raced, a mix of anticipation and fear coursing through his veins. As they prepared to descend into the town, a sudden commotion near the docks caught their attention. A group of soldiers, their red coats vivid against the darkening sky, seemed to be conducting a thorough search of incoming vessels. David and Alan exchanged a worried glance. Had word of their approach somehow reached Queensferry? Was their chance at justice about to slip through their fingers before they could even set foot in the town? David and Alan arrived at Queensferry, their hearts pounding with anticipation. The bustling port town held the key to their carefully laid plans, a chance to confront Ebenezer Balfour and reclaim David's rightful inheritance. The salty sea air mingled with the scent of fresh-baked bread as they made their way through the narrow, winding streets. Seagulls cried overhead, their raucous calls a stark contrast to the hushed whispers of the two companions. David's palms were slick with sweat, his mind racing with possibilities and fears. They soon found themselves at the door of Mr. Rankiler's office. The lawyer's reputation preceded him, a man of sharp wit and even sharper memory, especially when it came to the Balfour family history. As they stepped inside, the musty smell of old parchment and ink enveloped them, a tangible reminder of the weight of history about to unfold. Mr. Rankiler, his eyes glinting with intelligence behind wire-rimmed spectacles, leaned forward in his creaky chair. "Ah, young David," he said, his voice carrying the gravitas of long-held secrets. "I've been expecting you." As the lawyer began to unravel the tangled web of David's family history, each revelation hit the young man like a physical blow. His uncle's betrayal, his father's untimely death, the rightful ownership of the estate, it all came crashing down around him, reshaping his understanding of his own identity. With this newfound knowledge burning in their minds, David and Alan crafted a plan as intricate as a spider's web. The air in the small office crackled with excitement as they discussed their strategy, their whispers barely audible above the crackling fire in the hearth. David's heart raced, a mix of fear and exhilarations coursing through his veins. As dusk fell, casting long shadows across the land, David approached his uncle's house. The gravel crunched beneath his feet, each step feeling like a monumental effort. His heart thundered in his chest as he raised his hand to knock, the sound echoing through the silent night like a gunshot. Meanwhile, Alan melted into the darkness, ready to play his part as a fearsome Highland robber. Ebenezer's face, when he opened the door, was a mask of suspicion and fear. His eyes darted nervously, like a cornered animal searching for escape. David, mustering all his courage, spun a tale of a stranger seeking shelter. He could feel the tremor in his own voice, praying his uncle wouldn't notice. As the night wore on, the tension in the house grew thick enough to cut with a knife. Alan made his dramatic entrance, his voice booming through the house like thunder. Ebenezer, trapped between the devil and the deep blue sea, began to unravel. Words spilled from his lips like water from a broken dam, revealing the truth about David's father and the rightful ownership of the estate. With each passing moment, the noose tightened around Ebenezer's neck. David and Alan, like skilled puppeteers, manipulated the strings of their carefully crafted plan. The air in the room grew so thick with tension that David found it hard to breathe, his chest tight with anticipation. Finally, faced with the cold, hard facts and the threat of legal consequences hanging over him like the sword of Damocles, Ebenezer crumbled. His shoulders sagged in defeat as he reluctantly agreed to David's terms. The scratch of pen on paper seemed deafening as Ebenezer signed over control of the estate. David watched, his heart swelling with a mixture of triumph and sadness. He had won, but at what cost? As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, David found himself suddenly wealthy and respected. The weight of his new responsibility settled on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. He stood at the window, gazing out over the lands that were now his, feeling both elated and overwhelmed. But amidst the joy of his victory, a bittersweet moment awaited. Alan, his loyal friend and partner in adventure, had to flee to France to escape prosecution for his Jacobite activities. The realization hit David like a punch to the gut, reminding him of the price of their success. Under the cover of early morning mist, David and Alan stood facing each other, their eyes speaking volumes that words could not express. "I'll never forget what you've done for me," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise to help you in any way I can." Alan's eyes twinkled with a mixture of mischief and gratitude. "Aye, lad, I know you will. Take care of yourself, Davy." With a final clasp of hands, Alan melted into the mist like a ghost, leaving David alone with his thoughts. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, David turned to face his new life. He was no longer the naive boy who had set out on this journey, but a man forged in the fires of adventure and friendship. The estate of Shaw's stretched out before him, a testament to the extraordinary path that had led him here. With a deep breath, David stepped forward into his future, forever changed by the experiences that had shaped him into a man of courage and integrity. The adventures might be over, but the story of David Balfour, Laird of Shaws, was just beginning. As he walked towards the house, he felt a mix of excitement and trepidation, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead with the strength and wisdom he had gained on his incredible journey.
This book was generated using Speakter's AI voices. You can create human-like voiceovers in over 50 languages.